in this space of bringing together communities that span a variety of backgrounds to talk in the space of data rights. I'm very happy to introduce you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. I have to say, it's especially nice to see Nick, so hi, Nick. I wasn't expecting Nick to be here. This is really a treat for me. I've spent the past couple of years forcing myself on computer scientists, and it's a privilege to be in a group where I can kind of discuss some ideas that you will find insufficiently rigorous, and you will hopefully have some rigorous things to say about it. So today I really took the opportunity to try to speak to the theme of the workshop. I'll be talking about some joint work I've done with Karen Levy, who's also at Cornell, which we're calling Privacy Dependencies. This is a paper that we have in draft now. And I'll kind of just jump into it to give you some sense of what I mean by this term. So last year there were a couple of things that happened that got people to think about the fact that our individual privacy is often dependent on what we know about other people. And so on the one hand, we had the scandal around Cambridge Analytica, which involved being able to access information about our friends and friends of friends, if I remember correctly. And then just a month later, the Golden State Killer case, which was, I'll describe more if I get there in time, involved using genetic information of a relative to track down this particular killer. These were kind of both pointed to in some popular writing as this interesting example of how our intimate associations, in this case our friends and family, can expose us even if we have not revealed anything ourselves. And Karen and I wanted to kind of think more sweepingly about how this is true, not just these two particular cases, but across the many different mechanisms in which this is possibly true. And I should start by saying that, of course, I recognize that differential privacy as a definition of privacy, as something that's trying to deal with a particular problem, is in its own way trying to respond to the fact that we're able to figure out things about people based on information we know about others. And I'll get there at some point. But I think I also want to situate this in a kind of broader set of work, which is trying to think about privacy beyond individual privacy. And there's a couple of things I think that are relevant here. So the first is this long-standing work on the broad social value of privacy. And you can conceive of this as the idea that there is collective value to living in a society where we have individual privacy rights. Right? It allows us to do things, to cultivate ideas and associations that serve a collective interest. There's also been work done on group privacy. Some of the earliest work of group privacy was a kind of narrow conception. It was sort of this idea that we should have the right to huddle, to kind of have certain group associations. But there's been more recent work over the past decade that is really looking at the idea that there might be a privacy interest in the statistical properties of the group to which we belong. And those, I think, are kind of two relevant areas of literature. The stuff I'll be talking about is closer to these two final categories. Mark McCarthy, in an article from 2011, had this idea of privacy externalities, where the information that I disclosed might have some kind of externality in the sense it might implicate other people who did not disclose. And then in a more recent piece by Fairfield and Engel, there's a similar conception here where it's privacy as a kind of public good, where we are sort of compromising the public good when we make our own individual decisions. And what I'll try to do today is give a little bit of detail to these two final ideas. I'm going to set aside the first two, which I think are sort of well trodden. And I'm going to suggest that there's actually quite a lot to think about in these two final categories. And what I should say is that this work focused on exactly this problem, right? So the idea that if we're not necessarily in control of what others can know about us because there are other people whose disclosures implicate us, then this whole conceit of notice and consent is just fundamentally flawed. So this was sort of the style of argument that these papers were developing, trying to show that this is really not a matter of individual choice in any meaningful sense. What I'll try to talk about today is something slightly different. While I think what I'll describe will further reinforce that view, I want to kind of study the details of these different mechanisms, which I'm going to call dependencies. And I want to try to tease out what I think are the different normative values that attach to these different situations. And hopefully we can consider collectively some of the different relevant social practices, policies, and particularly some technical interventions that help us deal with these dependencies. And so I'll say at the start that Karen and I identify three, at the highest level, we say that there's three different types of dependencies. So one we call tie-based, another similarity-based, and the final is difference-based. And to preview a little bit, a lot of the work on differential privacy is really this last category. OK, but let me just jump into it. So I should say that this is really meant to kind of stimulate discussion about problems that are here kind of very stylized and not very rigorous. And I would love people to interrupt if they think this is something that they want to talk about more. But let me start. So
do you assume that these three are comprehensive?
Yes, OK, that's another good point. So we're not theoreticians, so there was no attempt to even aim for comprehensiveness. But it was meant to be a pretty exhaustive exercise. We wanted to really think, can we capture a lot of different things? Do we feel comfortable thinking that we've done a decent job of exploring the space? But I'm totally open to the idea that we've missed things completely, or that people might have other examples, or that this taxonomy is not sufficient. So yeah. OK, so to begin. Typebases, what we're thinking of is a situation where I'm able to I'm using Alice and Bob as the convention here, and I'll use the observer as a person who's learning things about, I'm going to say Bob in this case, right? So an observer in this case is able to learn things about Alice. Wait, hold on, about Alice. No. It's not great when you get tripped up on the first slide. OK. A situation where the observer is gathering information about Alice, but learns about Bob by virtue of learning something about Alice. And here it could be that they're capitalizing on the fact that Alice and Bob have a relationship and take advantage of that. And sometimes it can also be an attempt to make more sense of what the observer has learned about Alice by learning something about Bob. But here we kind of pack in a bunch of different scenarios that are quite distinct, where this seems to be what's going on. So I'll just quickly summarize them here, then go one by one. So on one case, we can identify an unknown Bob by virtue of his relationship to a known Alice. And I'll give the example of genetic information in a minute. We can also piggyback on observations of Alice to get at Bob. Or maybe we can incentivize Alice to disclose information about Bob. Or actually the opposite direction, which is that we can potentially incentivize Bob to give information about himself because he wants to be able to have some kind of communication with Alice that is facilitated by, for instance, a social network. Right? And then this kind of final category, which might be pushing the boundaries here, is the argument that we're justified in searching associates of Alice because they are, collecting information about Bob because Bob is an associate of Alice. Right? Or this will come to refer to stuff like government surveillance. OK, so the first case is maybe the most straightforward one, which is this was the familial search, right? So we find a DNA sample at a crime scene. We don't know who it belongs to, but there now exists these large databases of identified DNA samples. And what we might want to do is check to see if there's any partial match in that database, which might tell us that the person who was at the crime scene is at least some relative of the person who was there, right? And there are certain properties about DNA that also can tell us who that relative is, right? Is it their sister? Is it their child? Is it their cousin? And so on. So we can actually learn quite a lot, even if we don't necessarily know who this sample refers to. And so having this particular relationship, this particular quality, allows us to potentially identify Bob because Alice was willing to disclose her information to, for instance, 23andMe or one of these companies that now maintains these databases. And I think this is the scenario that has probably become most familiar to people, right? They have a pretty decent sense that your relative's willingness to participate in these things is somehow compromising your privacy. Right? A slightly different situation is what we can think of as incidental observation, where Bob is essentially caught in the net of information that's being collected about Alice. Some of this can be really trivial, like I'm in the background of some of the students that are being photographed graduating from Berkeley. And even though the intent wasn't necessarily to take a picture of me, I'm a bystander that gets captured. It can be a bit more kind of purposeful, right? So I install certain equipment in my house, which collects information about me, but then I invite in guests, and they're now implicated, right? Or it could be something like this, which I actually think about quite a lot. I might say that I don't want to use Google services. I'm going to object fundamentally to actually giving Google any of my information. And I might feel very principled in my way of behaving, but it may well be that there are many other people that I have to communicate with that actually use Gmail. And so the idea that I can remove myself unilaterally from contact with Gmail doesn't make sense if my interactions are facilitated through Google servers, for instance. Right. And then we can think about the way that incentives work into this. So in some cases, we might just try to incentivize Alice to just straight up tell us something about Bob. And so we can think of situations like having a confidential informant, putting pressure on criminals to disclose things about their collaborators, and so on. Or you can think of something like casually inviting people to upload their contact lists to the service to help you find their friends, which is really telling the service everything about your social network. Right? And it took some time to kind of think about where to put network effects in this taxonomy. And here it seems pretty obvious that if you think of network effects as creating incentives to participate in the network, it seems like you can imagine that it's precisely because many associates of Bob are on some particular social network that he therefore has incentives to disclose information as well, to participate. Right? And so in a way, it's like the decisions of other people to be on Facebook or what have you that is actually putting quite a bit of pressure on Bob to then ultimately capitulate as well. Okay. And then this final idea is that we might be justified in looking at people precisely because they're related to Alice, right? So in kind of national security context, you can imagine that we identify some person and we determine that they're a terrorist, and we can then say we are justified at looking at people 2 hops out from them, right? So the association is the justification for collecting information about these people. I guess the friends of friends is important here too. And you could think of that as a way of potentially learning more about Alice by learning things about her associates, but you can also just see it as an excuse in a way to kind of collect information about Alice's associates. So this kind of deals with a bunch of different scenarios that we think of as being largely about the kind of tie between people. And it does, I think, include a lot of different things, and I can imagine treating these quite differently. But the thinking was that this set of things was distinct from the next 2 large categories that I'll describe. OK, so let me now move to what we call similarity-based dependencies. You can think about it in these terms. So when Alice discloses something about herself, she may reveal certain things about Bob if Bob is understood to be similar to Alice in some respect. Right? And in particular, the observer might conclude that Bob is likely to share the disclosed trait by Alice if the observer already knows that Alice and Bob resemble each other across some relevant dimensions. This might be a sort of fancy way of describing the process of induction. Right? We're taking a fixed set of examples and we're trying to infer some rule that says that this particular sought-after feature tends to correlate with these particular other observed characteristics. Right? And it's important to at least acknowledge that in order to apply the rules that we might draw from observations from Alice and other similar people to Bob, we need to know something about Bob, right? And what we need to know is that Bob possesses what we would see as the sort of relevant characteristics that are similar to those held by Alice and others that allow us to make a kind of statistically motivated guess that Bob is also going to have the as yet undisclosed feature. And I think what's really important from the point of view of privacy, and this is a conversation I've had independently with some other people in the room over many years, is that unlike the sought-after trait, which might be perceived as sensitive or worthy of protection, these characteristics, which we discover to actually be good proxies or predictors of the trait we're looking for, might be much more readily observable or much more freely disclosed, precisely because they're not perceived as sensitive or really worrisome for other people to know about.
So is it right to say that this category is only covering inferences that you can draw because you have access to statistical information?
I think it's about regularities in observations of many people that you can, yes.
So, okay.
Yeah.
That sounds like what I meant.
That's right, yeah. And I think the language of Alice and Bob becomes a little unhelpful here because it's like one Alice. But I think for the sake of this section, it's worth thinking about Alice and many other people like Alice, and for this section, also like Bob, right? Yep.
Solon, it sounds like you're making the genetic argument, right?
So this is what's interesting. Actually, the kind of, I'll end with a case study, which is actually specifically about the fact that DNA has this kind of unique property that it simultaneously functions as a type-based dependency, a similarity-based dependency, and a difference-based dependency. And it's actually like not always clear to us like when different things are operating, but they're different, and different laws target different parts of this process. But I think, is that sort of anticipating your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just want to make sure.
But so you responded to Katrina that a question of whether this is a statistical attribute, and my question is, isn't it the way we learn in general, right? I mean, this is like...
Yeah, so I'll jump ahead 2 slides to to get to your point, and I'll come back. So yes, we're sort of like irrepressibly drawing rules from our experience. Our way of learning about the world in general follows this particular pattern. It's sort of foundational to human cognition. We're always making sense of any given observation by kind of comparing it to other things that we've seen in the past. And with respect to kind of individual observations of individuals, you can think of it as that we're always sort of making sense of any particular observation by thinking about that against the backdrop of other people we've observed with similar characteristics. Right? This is all maybe like an overly philosophical way of literally just describing what machine learning does, right? So like forget the philosophical language, just think of a traditional supervised machine learning task. Right?
Isn't this also telling us that this distinction between sensitive and insensitive, even in a specific context, is very artificial, because those insensitive attributes actually can encode a sensitive attribute.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so absolutely, and other people have made this remark for some years now. I mean, largely this point, right? So if the whole point is that like seemingly benign, innocuous details can be the basis upon which you draw an inference that is sensitive, then it sort of doesn't really make sense to distinguish between sensitive and non-sensitive information. In separate work, I kind of try to go into details about like why even the category is sensitive, even outside of this, doesn't necessarily make sense. We often have like very particular outcomes in mind about how that information will be used that explains why something is sensitive. And if we think about it in that way, it also just sort of unsettles this whole way of thinking. But yes, as a basic point, this should encourage us to kind of abandon the idea that just like there's no such thing as like some types of information that are uniquely identifying and others that are not. The same way here, like there isn't something that's sensitive information and other information that is not. Okay, and to be clear, right, not only is this like the basis of human cognition, this also can serve like pretty reasonably important functions in the sense that like it may be extremely expensive to go off and observe the thing that we're trying to infer instead. So inference can be like enormously important, in part because it allows us to reduce the cost of trying to collect the information directly. You can think of that as a bad thing in some senses too, right? Because maybe some of those costs are a natural barrier to getting information that we don't want to reveal, or maybe the discomfort someone might experience if you ask them explicitly for that information. So you can sort of circumvent that altogether. And here you can imagine like that's very dangerous because I should say, to explain this a little bit, people can think back many years to the Target pregnancy prediction scandal. I remember trying to think like, what is a simple heuristic to kind of like give a company that doesn't want to end up doing something like this? And I remember thinking like, maybe you should not infer something that you wouldn't be willing to ask someone about directly. Which is not the same thing as saying that like you cannot infer it. It's sort of saying if you are unwilling or reluctant to ask, it probably suggests that there's some norm that you are violating by trying to get at that information this way. And if you're using inference as a way to avoid the discomfort you might experience by having to ask that question, you should sort of take note of that, right? I don't think that's a particularly helpful heuristic because oftentimes we don't even really know why we find certain things like unsettling. We might disclose a lot of things. But you could see the point, right? That like there are certain norms that we're actually uncovering when we discover that people are uncomfortable with certain questions, and that this might be a mechanism to circumvent that altogether. Yes. Okay. So this was sort of like the setup. I think what's important here is that the task is often to find the ways in which people are relevantly similar with respect to the sought after characteristic. And the taxonomy I'll lay out here is by no means like really fundamental. It's just a sort of way of cutting things that I think of as being socially salient rather than being technically different. And so we can think about a couple of different ways in which in which people might be perceived as relevantly similar that raise particular concerns, right? So one thing might be people are relevantly similar in the sense that we're making inferences based on the company that they keep, including potentially their family members, like who are they related to. It could be that people are similar in the sense that they share socially salient characteristics with other people, so things like your race or your age or your gender or what have you. But you have no explicit social ties with them, right? These are not people that you know as friends or family. They're simply people who have similar social characteristics. And then finally, and perhaps the most unsettling, is the idea that we might find that there are ways in which people are relevant with respect to the sought-after trait that are not socially salient characteristics at all, right? These are just sort of seemingly arbitrary things that people would not recognize as any basis for shared identity.
Sorry, what does that mean, or what's an example of that?
Oh, sure. So imagine you have like a million pieces of information about where people browse on the web, right? And that we're going to then produce some kind of set, like a model which is trying to predict some particular feature. And while we might imagine that there's some kind of patterns here that the model is learning that are related to similar interests or something like that, it would be hard to think that like the groups that this model has learned sort of correspond to like socially meaningful characteristics.
In machine learning, a lot of times the hypothesis that you get, you don't understand what happens there. You get some thing that has no, you don't see the meaning.
It doesn't mean it's not there.
Well, it doesn't have to be there. Like we can, in many cases, generate like learned concepts that have nothing to do with the original concept that is underlying.
So there could be like, there could be a transform representation. There could be a whole bunch of things that are happening where like even the features don't have semantics or something, right? Where then it doesn't even make sense to imagine that we could think of this as some shared social characteristics.
I mean, one of the early manifestations that we discussed a lot was like premium birdseed and your likelihood of repaying a debt.
Yeah, I mean, we often make up these like kind of just so stories that are like some random magazine subscription plus like the fact that you shop at Walgreens means that you're going to vote for, like these kinds of things. And when those things correspond to our intuitions, we're like, oh yeah, of course, right? And when they don't, they're like, oh, interesting,
But it's suggestive that there is some latent, hidden explanation, right?
I mean, it's not to say that there isn't possibly, it's not to say that this is not sort of like acting as a proxy for something we might eventually discover corresponds to some distinct social group, but that the model itself is not using those characteristics directly in the way that it figures this out. I think you had a question too, Rachel.
I think it's not relevant anymore.
Or it could be pre-orders.
Or it could just be completely wrong. And I should point out that like this is it's a traditional problem of induction. Like there's a bunch of reasons why this is not necessarily true, but yeah.
So you may be going here in a minute, but I guess I don't see any difference here from the way in which we generically behave. How many of you, when you go through a TSA line, this is what I ask my class, when you go through a TSA line, how many of you make judgments about the nature of the people who are right in front of you?
About how fast they'll be?
About how fast they're going to be.
Yeah.
On what basis?
Whether they have kids.
I mean, there's lots of different things that you look at, right? So we're all making inferences all the time. And just to ground it in a financial world, so part of the reason, my husband regulates national banks, so one of the things that the small local banks do is they use personal knowledge about an individual and about the family and about the church or the synagogue or whatever that they go to, and they then make judgments on the ability to repay. So I think what you're saying here is that you're just codifying or writing down the zillions of judgments that human beings do at all times.
Yeah, and so in this separate work, which I won't go into in detail, I try to differentiate the fact that we're constantly making inferences about each other from what seems to be unique about the kind of inferences we can draw with machine learning. Even so, right, even if we stick to the fact that humans are doing this, it's still important to recognize that like my ability to draw inferences about you, Julia, depends crucially on things I've learned about other people who I would see as similar to you, right? So that alone, I think, is the observation I'm trying to make. I'm not necessarily going to give a normative theory about one that's okay and one that's not. But the very fact that like I can bring to bear information I've learned about others when I'm trying to make sense of you is the key point.
There's nothing special about, and I guess this is probably your point, but there's nothing special about machine learning. This is These are facts about.
It's just writing down
how
It's much more
science and
complex.
inference works.
It's much more complex, and then humans, we try to understand why we make the decision. It's less understandable.
Right, it's writing down the human rules.
No, it's much more complex, and you don't. And the hypothesis doesn't try to understand why it's correct. It finds causes to why it's correct.
Okay, I'll give a tiny preview of what like the argument could be. Like one thing is that like machine learning could potentially learn the same kinds of rules that we as humans have drawn from our own experiences, and the fact that we can automate that is itself potentially a big deal for privacy. The second thing is that we are possibly also learning to make inferences that humans would never be able to make, and that is also itself, I think, an interesting privacy question.
Just, I think the use of socially salient is maybe doing work that you're not being completely clear about here. And I think maybe what you mean by socially salient is like things that we would view as a reasonable justification versus things that humans wouldn't view, or things that would intuitively make sense versus things that appear random to humans. Because otherwise, I don't know what social salience.
Yeah, I take your point, and I think also, again, this other work, I think I'm going the direction you're describing here. But for this, I wanted to make a differentiation between socially salient and not, because discrimination law is this, right? It's saying that like when we're trying to make sense of people by thinking of them as being similar on the basis of their race or gender, we're going to say that that's wrong,
But
right?
then just socially salient, I just don't know what that means.
Okay. Okay.
So I would just
Sure.
be clearer about what you mean there.
Okay, thank you.
No, but like now, could you?
Continue?
It seems like there are
No,
a few pieces to it.
what does it mean?
Yeah, one piece seems to be maybe about the visibility of the characteristic. It seems that there's something troubling about the characteristics that we wouldn't even noticed about people being used. But it seems like you're
Yeah, so here I really mean like, I mean like really what would we see as like if someone were to ask us like, articulate your identity, right? Like what are the categories that you might use to describe yourself? And I think like the ways in which we see ourselves as being similar to people in terms of our social identities would be things like, you know, where we happen to live, what our religion is, these kinds of things. Whereas there can be things in which like we would never self-identify as belonging to a group in any meaningful sense using this category is what I think.
Genetic makeup, right? Like I don't feel like I'm genetically X, right? Like, but it's not something I would identify as. But is that what you mean?
But
Yeah, genetic becomes complicated because, yeah, but yes, I think.
But is it, so when socially, like you're using the term socially salient just in a bunch of different ways, right? One, you were saying, oh, it's about protected attributes, and then you just said it was about ways in which we might identify. So, oh, you're a university professor, which is a much broader set of things. And when you were talking about like little social salience, it sound like I think these are fuzzy, right? But I just think you should, just to clarify, what is it that you're trying to distinguish? And
I mean, maybe if I go through the examples, because this is just the setup, I can maybe clarify, but I still think it's fuzzy. Like I would not assert that this is some clean boundary, but I take your point. Yeah, Aaron.
Not to stop you from going on, but when you say social salience, one thing that it seems to me it might mean is sort of information asymmetry. Like, for example, on Facebook, when I'm deciding that I'm going to make some things public and some things private, so I'm going to, you know, make that I'm a university professor public. I'll make the fact that I've liked various TV shows public, but I'll hide my, sexual orientation or something. Yeah, like maybe the reason I don't mind you inferring things about my politics from the fact that I'm a university professor is because when I made it public, I sort of understood that people could make inferences from that. But when you infer things about my sexual orientation from the likes I've made, like maybe the reason why I'm discomfited by that is that I didn't realize that there were correlations there that you could use to make inferences. Is that?
Yes, and so I had this challenge of deciding which of two things to present. And the thing I chose not to present would have gone into detail about exactly this. And this is meant to just make me a more like high level, let me talk about a bunch of different things. But yes, except that like I even worry about that being the way we try to adjudicate, because one way to handle that problem was just to tell everyone all the things that we're now going to be able to use as the basis for inference, and that's a terrible world to live in as well, right? Where like suddenly I now know there's a bunch of things that might be the basis for inference making. In some sense, yes, I'm aware of that, but now I live in a world in which a bunch of things I'm now doing, which I previously didn't see as particularly telling, I now have to be very careful with because I recognize that it might be the basis for inference. So it also gets complicated.
You're saying it might be bad for me to know that people can make inferences about?
It might be if we say that the reason we don't like it is because it's unexpected, the response might be just make sure it's expected. And what I'm trying to say is that like that is not a solution to this problem if it just means that we now have to be even more careful about our disclosures.
Chilling effect.
Chilling effect. Yeah.
So I'm a little lost, and here's why. For me, information, it's not like we're information. We could say all human beings are information, everything in the world is information. And we live in an age which likes to see everything as information. And recently or data, right? And it's interesting because I think in the last century, the analogy for human beings was that they were mechanical objects, like clocks. So like we've made a switch in our analogies at some point, and we're taking our analogy a little too seriously, let's say. But to step back, like when I was trying to understand privacy and social networks, like it was very clear that Facebook represents almost all information relationally, right? And it's a graph, right? Like the only things that are kind of not relational are maybe your name, age, or address or something. Everything else is, and even those might be in the graph as a relation. So are you talking about representations of information, or are you saying information exists somehow in space? Are you saying we're information? I got a little lost.
No, I'm saying that like the way that we're able to draw
and observing, because information is very much about observation.
This is not observation, which is important, right? So it's saying that like I observe certain things about this group of people, and I determine that this one individual I'm now looking at resembles them in this set of ways, which allows me to bring to bear what I've learned from observing things about them to my ability to make sense of this new person, right? Which is literally what the machine learning task is in general, and which is true of all inductive reasoning. And so this is not saying that like information exists in the world and we're just sort of uncovering it. I'm trying to describe the fact that like the way I'm able to actually make sense of any particular individual is by comparing them to other people which I see as being similar to them.
Yeah, but you already modeled people as attributes, right? Like that's a huge decision as to how they're going to be informationalized. And then you're comparing that to seeing, which is maybe information, but maybe something more complex than that. So I'm like lost in this set of equivalences and substitutions that you're making. That seems...
I'm not sure I understand the substitution. Like, even if I were to stick with like the human looking at the world, so let's forget data altogether.
Right.
I don't see why what I'm describing is substituting.
Maybe we should let's move on.
Okay. Okay, how much time do I have left?
Let's say 13 minutes.
Okay, all right, I'll try to. Okay, so to give some substance to this, right, so one particular reason we might not like this type of thing is that we can end up basically punishing the son for the sins of the father or something like that, right? So we might say that given that we know that Bob is the son of Alice and we know certain things about Alice, we're going to draw some inference about Bob, right? Here, this can be based on a couple of different theories. It could be the idea that certain things are hereditary, but it also could be some belief that children are sort of raised by their parents in particular ways. That means it's likely that they will end up having certain properties that the parent had as well. And in fact, we even have certain instruments that do exactly this, right? So Compass, people might not know, has questions which asks about the criminal history of parents. And so this is used as a way to make a prediction about the likelihood that someone would recidivate if they were released pending trial, right? The Allegheny County tool that is the subject of a chapter in Virginia Eubanks' book, and also some of the work that was done by colleagues in the FAP-STAR world. That too actually looks at whether or not you are the child of someone. So to predict the likelihood that you will be involved in some kind of child neglect or abuse case, they actually look to see if you as a child had been abused or neglected. Right? So there's a sort of like way in which this carries forward across different generations. And actually there's some interesting work that's been done by Abby Jacobs looking at how you can actually predict the likelihood that someone might end up abusing opiates given the fact that they live with someone who's abused opiates. And so here's a bunch of reasons why we might think this is true, but like even if we just did this statistically, forget like trying to hypothesize the causal mechanism that generates this, we can just observe this to be true. And we might have some specific concerns when it's something this proximate. Yeah.
Why is this different than the tie-based inference from before?
So the tie-based is like observing Bob directly via Alice. Here, this is, I'm going to say, like, I know that Alice and Bob live together, but I'm going to make an inference about Bob given the fact that I know certain things about Alice.
But, so the reason you think this is wrong is because it's inaccurate, so that, let me if I had perfect information about, this is like, the more information I have, the better the inference would be. Would that be good? Like,
no,
then the prediction would be accurate?
I'm remaining agnostic both on whether or not this is going to be accurate or whether or not it's even going to be something we see as good or bad. I'm simply trying to make the actually very basic point that what we know about any person depends on what we know about other people, right? So there's some work that we're doing in the paper that try to draw out like a normative question, but I just want to make like the very basic point and show how it works in slightly different social configurations. And we might then have discussions about, do these configurations actually matter to our ability to assess whether we think it's appropriate or not?
Right, but it just follows that if, for instance, in the previous slide, when you talked about the relevant similarities, the more diverse, the diversity of groups that we have, the diversity of information that we have, would actually allow us to define more precisely the similarities. We have more similarities that we can compare, and so, our prediction would be,
Yes, and that actually could be like related to the talk, right?
We will be able to actually compare one individual to another, one specific trait to another, if we have like perfect information, right?
Yes, and sort of if we think about the previous talk right before lunch, that was sort of the direction it was going to, right? Which is that we want to find other relevant similarities that allow us to then make a better prediction about a whole range of people, something like that. Okay, I'll just kind of speed up a little bit. So, it might not be like your family or the people you live with, but it might be like the company that you keep. And so the study that kind of got everyone thinking about this was the study on Gator from many years ago, where we can infer someone's sexual orientation based on the fact that other people that they are related, that they're kind of expressly connected to on the network have disclosed their sexual orientation. There's all this work that's been done trying to use similar data to do credit scoring, and I kind of think of ICWSM as a conference that just kind of specializes in this work, right? So like using social media data to build models to infer all sorts of other things. And at this point, it sort of arrived at the interesting conclusion. This is some work from earlier this year from Garcia, where it's pretty clear in some cases that the information that other people disclose can be more informative than the information that we disclosed. And it made me actually think that like this can be even so strange where like the disclosure of the many Alices that we're associated to can end up saying more about me than they do actually about Alice, which is a very interesting possibility. And then to kind of come to this like socially salient group idea, right? So here we can think about the traditional way that like marketing has been based on demographics. And we tend not to see these things as particularly troublesome, right? Like you're going to target me based on my gender and age or something like that. But it's actually quite remarkable if you think about how much we actually are able to infer about someone just given those two attributes, right? Just knowing someone's age and gender can tell us a remarkable amount about people precisely because we've been able to observe different statistical patterns across these different populations. And while we might not find that particularly unsettling at this point, like it's worth understanding just how powerful it is to be able to bring observations of other people to bear on any particular person. Okay, in some work that I did with Helen a couple years ago, we talked about how this has interesting implications for consent because it turns out that it may not require many people to actually disclose this information in order for us to then be able to infer it about everyone else. And in fact, it might be a very small minority of the population that willingly discloses some attribute, and then we're able to find those characteristics that reliably predict it, and then see who else has those characteristics and apply that inference to the rest of the population. And it's worth explaining that, of course, this is really the basis of scientific research. Often what we're trying to do is find some kind of generalizable result. And so in some sense, this is a positive externality, right? The degree to which I can use this information to make inferences about others is to everyone else's benefit, because, for instance, I'm able to treat their medical condition. But we can also think of it as a negative externality if it allows us to infer a health condition which then use to discriminate against them, for instance. Right? Right, and I guess just to kind of put a point on this, which I accept needs work, you know, like the lookalike audience function that we talked about yesterday morning, you know, the goal here is to just sort of like arbitrarily find those features which happen to be held by other people who have expressed interest in a particular brand or a Facebook page, and it matters not at all what those features happen to be. The goal is just to find what features happen to be common across all the people that have previously interacted with that page or brand or whatever, right? And it's extremely unlikely from my perspective that if we were to observe what that entailed, that would actually be some set of features that people see as being particularly meaningful in the way that they're being grouped. Okay, and then hopefully in the remaining time, I'll talk about difference-based dependencies. So here, the idea is that by revealing information about herself, Alice may allow the observer to learn something about Bob by making herself distinguishable from Bob. Right? We can think of this in a straightforward, we can think of this in a straightforward situation of a process of elimination, where let's say we have some fixed set of people who we have suspicions of committing a crime, and then we go and ask each person to produce some kind of alibi, and as more people produce alibis, the denominator becomes smaller, and we have a greater sense that the remaining people are of a higher likelihood of having been the person who committed the crime, right? Okay, I'll speed that up. So in that case, just to be clear, right, Alice individually is sort of disclosing things just to prove her innocence, but in the process is actually further implicating Bob. Right? We can also think of anomaly detection, where the ability to actually detect what is anomalous depends crucially on looking at what everyone else has done, right? So the behaviors of Alice and all other people become the baseline against which Bob is then compared. And here, you know, it can be something like the fact that I use electricity at a much higher rate than my neighbors, suggesting that there might be some kind of marijuana growing, right? And the way I'm able to do this is by comparing what is the normal level of electricity use in the area or for comparable sized houses to mine, right? So again, like it's precisely because I look different than all other Alices that I'm then implicated. And then we can think of adverse inference, where here it's the refusal to disclose certain things that allows us to then draw an adverse inference about people. So for instance, Alice might be very willing to disclose something, and my hesitancy might suggest to the person that there's reasons to be suspicious about me. And it's precisely because Alice is so readily willing to disclose that it then implicates my non-disclosure. And this can be something as trivial as the fact that, you know, yeah, I'm not willing to post a photo of myself on an online dating site, whereas everyone else is, and therefore you're going to conclude that I must be a horribly ugly person. Or if I don't post, like, you know, my resume on LinkedIn, that there must be something that is a little bit suspect. And I think here it's the kind of familiar premise that you have nothing to hide, and if you are going to hide something, there must be something you want to keep secret. And I think what's very interesting about this is like the very idea of what counts as hiding is itself a function of what is not, what is normally done by other people, right? And so even the very activity that we would see as privacy preserving is definitionally based on what is common or uncommon behavior in the rest of the population, right? So for instance, right, like locking your door to your car, closing the door to the bathroom, these are not seen as particularly telling because everyone happens to do them. Whereas if I go out of my way to use encryption when everyone else doesn't, there might be reasons to be suspicious that I'm doing something wrong. Right? Okay, in the remaining seconds, so then I also want to come to what Rachel discussed in the Unbaked Ideas session yesterday, which is thinking of unraveling as a particular instance of adverse inference, where in particular what we're trying to do is rank order people. And so there are going to be incentives when I want to be able to distinguish myself from others to disclose that I have the kind of desirable attribute. And as we learned, Bo, having now observed that Jamie has revealed this fact, will want to disclose. And the next most healthy person in the room would go on down the line until we've all disclosed, precisely because we wanted to distinguish ourselves from the remaining people who are going to be either subject to adverse inference or assumed to kind of have like the average score of the remaining population. Right? Okay, do I have any more time?
Half a minute.
Okay, so just very quickly, what is interesting about genetic information is that it can be used in all three ways. And the fact, and the reason that's true is because it has the following properties. First, that it's uniquely identifying, that it demonstrates these relationships between people, and that we can use it to predict future risks like health disorders and so on. We talked a little bit about the tie-based dependency familial search with Golden State, but actually it turns out that the Golden State Killer also used this other dependency, which is that we can see that certain genes tend to correlate with certain physiological expression. And so they actually use this to kind of figure out what this person's likely to look like given what we know to be common patterns of appearance given certain genes. And they use that to then further limit the candidate set. And then you can also think of kind of difference-based genetic dependencies in the sense that, let's say we have a set of people which we have reason to believe were suspects in a crime. We ask people to give their DNA. And then we're going to kind of systematically check those people against the sample we have. People who refuse to disclose, we're going to be suspicious about, so this will be adverse inference. And so again, here you can think of it as being a mechanism to say, given that this is a finite set, everyone who is proving themselves not to be the culprit is also then implicating the remaining people. Okay, and the very, very final thing I'll say is that there's an amazing case from a couple years ago called the devious defecator. It's actually a legal case. Has anyone heard of this? No. Yes. Okay. Okay, so very quickly, it's actually a case that involved the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, or Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which, if you actually kind of look at the legislative record, was designed to kind of address the first two types of dependencies. It was trying to prevent insurers and employers from making predictions about, for instance, your health, given information about your genes. And the reason it also was related to tie-based was that it wanted to prevent them from also using your known relationship to someone else who you also happen to do their health about, right? And in this particular case, there was a warehouse where apparently someone was like defecating on the floor of the warehouse, and they couldn't figure out who was doing this. So they actually kind of figured out who were the people who were working at this time and in this part of the warehouse that would be possible suspects. And they asked those people, two people in particular, to give DNA samples. And it turns out that neither of those people were actually the ones, there was no match, right? But then what ended up happening is that they sued the employer because they said that this was a violation of GINA. But what's really interesting about this is that the way they were going to use the genetic information was not the tie-based or similarity-based dependency. It was this difference-based dependency, right? In the sense that they were trying to figure out, can I identify that this is the person because they have the same DNA as the stool sample? And interestingly, it turned out that the particular way in which the law was written allowed for this interpretation, which said that like genetic information couldn't be used to make essentially like termination determinations. And so it actually was decided in the favor of the employees, but everyone found this to be very surprising because the intent of the law clearly was not to cover that particular problem. It was designed to cover the fact that they don't want to make predictions about people's health, right? So this is all just a kind of cute way of saying that like the kind of elaborate taxonomy I laid out here explains what people found quite surprising about this legal result. But it also shows that there are laws that are in fact tailored to some of these problems, right? So GINA is an example where the law is definitely trying to target these similarity-based dependencies and to some extent the tie-based dependencies but originally it did not seem to be targeting this kind of difference-based dependency. Okay, that's it.
Should we let Elmo's give his comment and then move to Q&A? Is that all right?
Didn't wait till you hear the answer. Hey. So thanks for the excellent talk. I actually prefer to be a discussant after a talk that's not as excellent, but your life is easier, but that's what I got. And I think the discussion here was really, really useful discussion here, and in Inbal's talk, in emphasizing this point that kind of going back and forth between the different worlds raises all these different concerns and different points of view, and therefore the discussion has to be in this level of conceptualization rather than kind of things that are already ready. Okay, here is what we as a community created, take it and do something with it. And I thought that all these perspectives were very useful, but I should say that there are some absolute truths that we shouldn't ignore. So humans are clearly not clocks and are obviously not just information. What's clearly the case is that people are computations. But beyond that, everything else was very... and another point about this discussion, thing that came up in the discussion that I thought was very interesting is this question about what do we understand about what our machine learning does, which is very interesting, but we should perhaps contrast it with what do we understand about what humans do. And usually we talk about it as a rationalization when we're trying to explain perhaps to ourselves what are we doing. And it's not clear that this difference is that huge, but that's a different discussion. One thing that appears in the paper, which I really, really like, and not here, not in the talk, was this notion of expectation of privacy, which is something I'm very fond of from my years of legal education, watching Law and Order for hours and on. And I think that it's interesting to think about differential privacy in this perspective as well, and in the perspective of dependencies. And I think in the Chronicles of DP, one of the earliest example is this example of a health database where studies are done and about the connection between smoking and cancer. And it turns out that there is a connection, and therefore a smoker's health insurance rises even if they weren't in the data set. And we somehow feel that this is okay because the smoker doesn't have an expectation of privacy to erase all of the information from everybody else's information to prevent this study. We as a society would rather have this kind of a study, even though it allows us to compromise the privacy of this individual that now we know has a higher chance of having cancer. And there is an entire kind of way of thinking about what does DP do, or what's the privacy in differential privacy through this notion of what's the expectation of privacy. Perhaps we think that erasing everybody else's information is not reasonable, but erasing your information from the data set and perhaps the information of a few people that are correlated with you is reasonable, is a reasonable expectation of privacy. And there are, through this line of thinking, there are other notions and variants of differential privacy that come up from considering different dependencies between individuals. And there's quite a bit of research about variants of DP that takes into account different kinds of dependencies. I'll mention a couple of things, pufferfish, and there's a lot of work on DP in the context of social networks. And all of this could be viewed as what's the reasonable expectation of privacy, which is a term that allows decision makers to think about it in a way that would translate later to an exact technical definition, an exact variant of DP. And again, in this process, we'll need to talk about social norms and practices. We'll need to talk about regulations and laws. but we'll also need the theory part of DP, and we'll also need machine learning people that will help us discover the kind of dependencies that do exist and take them into account when we're thinking about the right version of DP. I don't know if I wrote anything else that I wanted to emphasize here, but yeah, I think that these were my comments.
Okay, Colby, you made such a sad face.
Yeah, so I want to go back to the question of how much this taxonomy covers. And I think that the examples that you gave and the taxonomy covers well the cases where the dependencies are salient or the inferences are salient. But we also have these cases where dependencies are very weak. For instance, if I told you that there are 10 people in this room who are theoretical computer scientists, then if I show you such 10 people, you know that everybody else is known in theoretical computer science. But this is a rather weak dependency in this population. But what happens more and more now is that the ability to combine these weak dependencies together results in strong dependencies. For instance, the census work on typically this would be like kind of reconstruction attack, like the census work combining a lot of statistics, each of them creating very weak dependency between members of the population, but when you put them together, you get the strong dependency. You manage to reconstruct the data very accurately. You manage to re-identify about 17% of the US population and get their exact values. These are examples of how you put these dependencies together. And I think one issue is that this is an area where we haven't yet developed expectations. Like humans are not used to think about these dependencies. Usually we just say these are so insignificant that we can neglect them. And of course, also the legal writing is almost oblivious of these dependencies.
No, I agree. I mean, I think like I sort of conveniently sidestepped like the more explicitly differential privacy discussion here, and if I had even attempted it, it would have probably moved in this direction. But yeah, I mean, I think like what was interesting to me about the project was sort of like going from a sense that there are maybe a small number of, well, differential privacy problems, plus some other things where I feel like it's very clearly a dependency, to kind of seeing it all over the place, right? That there are like a bunch of other things that are not necessarily covered by differential privacy. And I was sort of interested in thinking about like how some of those problems might lend themselves to similar kind of theoretical formal work in computer science.
Yeah, so you mentioned notice and consent, but to put like an umbrella across this entire project, give or take whether any of the details stand up to scrutiny, and I'm sure many of them will, my proposition is that this is a repudiation of the definition of privacy as control over information about ourselves. Just want to hear you say yes to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah. Yes. Nick?
Yeah, I kind of want to contradict that a little bit. Like, let's say you gave this talk again to a different audience and deleted the word privacy and replaced it with inference or learning. Does the talk still make sense? It kind of seems to me like maybe you were telling us, that's not to say it's not relevant to privacy. I think it's extremely relevant to privacy. But it kind of seems like you're just helping us categorize ways that the observer learns about people. And you're giving us an interesting example where you can learn about people through information about some others. And then whether it's a privacy interest or not is a separate question. And it's a very interesting one, and we can learn a lot from it. Kind of in the same way that we kind of had this revolution where, Arvind and Paul Ohm and all these people said, oh, look, you can re-identify people from pieces of information that might be surprising. And is that necessarily privacy? Well, it's going to be a privacy issue because we're learning something about how people learn information about other people. And so I'm wondering if you could just like put aside the privacy for a little bit and just say this is one of the many interesting ways that people learn about other people. And then we don't have to immediately decide which ones are bad and good, or which ones are against privacy or not.
Yeah, I think like descriptively that's probably a more faithful account. I thought what was interesting about some of the work though was like looking at discovering like, oh, this is a problem that like the anonymous communications community has worked on. This is a problem that the differential privacy community has worked on. This is a problem that like like it was kind of interesting to see like which of these had already been like recognized as a technical problem in some sense within computer science, which were the things that the law has already recognized as a problem and therefore tried to regulate. I think like the similarity stuff is the most difficult, both conceptually and I think like technically, because it's like really unstructured and like who the hell knows how to begin to make arguments about like what is a reasonable inference based on the things we can observe about others. But I still was interested in kind of being able to say like, here's what's going on, and like I was interested in then thinking to myself and Karen as well, like which of these problems have been addressed. And Gina was like a kind of fun case where like, this actually seems to be addressing something but not other things. I think Julia might have been next, Anna.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on that. So the whole point or at least a major reason for using data for research is precisely for inference and prediction. So you had the example of the Allegheny Youth Children's Services. So what they were able to do was they were able to rank the probability that a kid was going to be abused, and they gave it a score of 20 bins. And as a result of adding that information to each individual's case, in addition to the caseworker's own best judgment, which had its own rules set in, they were able to reduce the maltreatment of children by large numbers and deaths of children. So, and I'll talk about this a bit more. So that seems to me not a privacy issue. That seems to me, well, it is, but inherent in collecting any data in order to allocate any resources, in order to do policy effectively, you are making decisions about someone's propensity. So that's exactly right. You're using that information either for or against them, and that's at the core what policy is about. So I don't...
No, I totally agree, and I wasn't trying. In fact,
I'm not saying. I'm just verbalizing.
Yeah,
what he was
the one thing I'll just say, and like what was interesting about the Allegheny example, and certainly about Compass, is that people find it objectionable because it's using information about like an immediate relative to make an inference about this other person, and we should probe that intuition. Like, what is it that actually upsets people that we might decide that they actually need to be incarcerated pending trial because their parents have been involved in the criminal justice system previously? Or what does it mean to think that there's a higher probability that this person will abuse their children because they were abused by their parents, right? These are probably all true in some sense, right? We can show statistically that this is actually, there's evidence to support this, but we should ask, like, why do we intuitively find this like distasteful or upsetting? I think Adam was next, and then...
I know there are like 5 hands up
okay.
right now, but we should probably, unfortunately, wrap up the session. Thank you very much.